presentation I'm going to give today is from Mariana Osuna Castañeda, who unfortunately could not attend tonight's event. She's from the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Her presentation is titled Some Notes on Epistolary as Rhetorical Strategy for the America's New Nations. Before the overseas territories of the Spanish Empire took the path of armed rebellion, and again, this year marks, for many Latin American countries, the bicentennial of these movements of independence, not only for Mexico, but for Argentina, for example. There was another type of agitation, a revolution of ideas. The tie between ideas and action, between the pen and the sword, is neither mechanical nor clear. Nevertheless, it is impossible to deny the intense intellectual and cultural process of the Enlightenment influenced writers in the Americas as much as it did Europeans. The impact of the Enlightenment can be measured in a number of ways. Circulation of books, transformations in everyday life and institutions, new political perspectives on regal power. In this presentation, I, Mariana Osuna Castañeda, will examine how a particular writing practice, that of the fictitious and public letters, allows us to see the changes or new processes of sociability preceded and led to armed struggle in Latin America. Through this examination, we might see reasons why an epistolary model of sociability remained in practice among writers and politicians during and after the mentioned armed struggles. The letter writing practice, as it was known in the 18th and 19th century, was present not only as a private writing genre, as a personal letter, but as an essential device for the individual's social life, as well as for commerce, as popular manuals known as secretaries in the French tradition demonstrate. It was through such letters that networks of personal, commercial, and political relationships were built. Given the importance of letters, two conclusions emerge. Writing letters were one of the skills to which writers dedicated a great deal of amount of time and rhetorical effort. This was also true of the literate population in general. In this sense, most people were familiar with letter writing and reading. Widespread use of letters distinguished the genre from other genres such as the essay, treatises, sermons, or theater plays. The letter was a common social practice that had to be learned even by the most literate people of Latin America. However, perhaps the most popular kind of letter writing was a personal letter, which in contrast to diplomatic or commercial kinds of letters, possesses certain fundamental characteristics for its later literary and social development. One, in personal letters, both the sender and the recipient are related by friendship. This is a culturally essential value to understand the humanist culture that will last in the modern societies, not only as a peculiarity, but as an essential part of the new sociability proposed by the Republican ideas, for example. Two, such brotherhood turns out to be represented in this type of letter in many ways. First, the conversational style, which brings intimacy by means of the language between sender and recipient, free of any style affectation. Familiar letters imitates conversation between equals. One may point out this as the biggest literary effect required and appreciated. Three, in contrast to the commercial or political letters, personal letters do not have thematic restrictions. Everything fits in them. The vicissitudes of the private life, marriage, birth, illness, disputes, unease, or happenings are considered private. When the public matters are narrated as part of the private life in a personal letter, two things happen. Private life is contextualized by a major event, and public matters acquire a subjective perspective. Four, the spatial and temporary horizon of the sender plays a large role in the personal letter, since it is written from a precise here as a precise now. One can say the temporality of the letter is, in only one sense, present. Five, consequently, the material narrated in the personal letter is necessarily the subjective appreciation from the one who writes, expresses freely thanks to the confidence established by the friendship between equals. For all this, the act of letter writing acquires a force of testimonial or intimate confidence. In contrast to the prestige of epic poetry or dramatic plays, minor genres like the personal letter, the use of which expanded significantly during the 16th century, did not have strict rules, although they did appear in rhetoric manuals. This relative freedom of form supported the genre's growth, where writing an epic poem was perceived by both the author and reader in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries as a creative act and prestigious act, more demanding than the writing, edition, and publication of a collection of letters. Writing in minor key, that is sort of the minor genres of the personal letter, clearly had its own rhetorical advantages. One can say that the letter is a gesture of a communicative act between individuals and at the same time a witness or written evidence of such mentioned communication. Its intention is that in the first instance to close the distance between correspondents to feel an absence, or at least a perceived sense of absence. With this purpose, the specific horizon from where the letter was written emerges and is drafted at once, is sort of created at once at the moment of reading, which remains always suspended at the end of every correspondence. This way, the letter writing act, as Claudio Guillen points out, needs of imagining the reader in order to answer to him, and the recipient will do the same. In this way, a dialogue continues. The conversational style, the brevitas, the relation of equality between correspondents, the private character of what is alluded to in the familiar letter, provide other features, a literary space for an invention or the invention of brotherhoods, a reproduction of friends and friendships that maybe have been, when both maybe are absent in real space. This structure creates and reproduces sociability as it was needed by the literate population and their particular purposes and interests. In the case of Spanish America, the literate population exploited such rhetorical characteristics of the letter to raise their voice, not only as a denunciation of the established social order, but also as a chance of speaking and appealing to like-minded individuals. It is time to bring the ideas just mentioned above about the personal letter, letter writing and sociability in modern society among literates, to a specific instance. I'm talking about the letter, quote, the letter addressed to Spanish Americans by Juan Pablo Vizcardo y Guzmán, written in 1792, or in Spanish, Carta dirigida a los españoles americanos. And letters from an American to a Spaniard, Servando Teresa de Mier, published in London from 1811 to 1812, or in Spanish, Cartas de un Americano a un Español. Both writers chose to write their ideas and emotions or their thoughts in letters, prefiguring in the same act or creating in the same act their audience to whom they were writing to. David Brading records that of the letters and documents delivered by King Rufus to Francisco de Miranda, Miranda selected the letter from Jesuit Vizcardo to be published in French in 1799. Perhaps, quote, because, quote, in contrast to his other writings of those years, the letter was written as a public manifesto. As such, it differed in its intensity and rhetorical passion. The letter was conceived in Spanish, translated into French by Vizcardo himself. And thanks to Francisco de Miranda, the letter turned out to be published in 1799 in France, later in Spain in 1801, and finally into English in 1808. Again, this is the moment where the independence movements are sort of beginning to germinate in Latin America. In 1806, when Miranda arrived in Venezuela and distributed copies of it, in 1886, Miranda arrived in Venezuela and distributed copies of this letter. This is a very significant letter. It says the Inquisition, the Inquisition in Mexico, condemned it in 1810 for being, quote, revolutionary and sophistic, end quote. considering it to be much more fearsome and a bigger danger, quote, in America and especially in Mexico than the current tyrant Bonaparte. Okay? The condemnation gains more strength when we know that in 1812, the Guadalupeños, right, a secret underground organization, sent a copy of this very same letter to José María Morelos, who was a former leader of the revolutionary troops. And again, for me, this is also significant because Morelos is located in the pantheon of Mexican heroes of the independence movement. And then we also forget that Morelos himself was a rhetoric professor. And also key to that as well is that many of the independence leaders, especially in Mexico, were rhetoric professors. The father of the Mexican independence, like George Washington, for example, Father Hidalgo, was a rhetoric professor. And I think we have to forget that. So in some ways, rhetoric is at the key at that, in that sense. As soon as the personal letter as textual genre reached the public space, the title operates as a kind of salutatio, right? As a salutation. In this case, the title salutation tells us much about the stimulated brotherhood needed to get writer and reader closer. So in the interest of time, I'll skip a little bit forward. I consider the salutatio and addressing of this letter, that is to say, the direction in terms of movement, as a bidirectional movement. On one hand, it appealed to members of a community which is created or imagined just when Vizcarra writes it, in terms of an epistolary rhetoric. And on the other hand, this community of individuals is recognized as a community because it can be appealed to. The intimacy achieved for the epistle contributes to, quote, emotionally legitimize peoples and nations. Besides, as soon as this community recognizes itself as the recipient of this letter, the sender achieved his own existence. He is one of us. He's a compatriot. Just because those compatriots sort of deem or bestow this sense of commonality or brotherhood through this letter. The fraternity appealed in the letter starts since the beginning. Vizcarra writes using we and ours. The new world is our homeland, for example. His history is our history, and it is that we must examine our present situation for us to decide. Again, this is sort of direct quotes. To take the necessary party to the conservation of our own rights and of our own successors. And again, creating the sense of commonality between, a wide hemisphere of potentially people who never see each other. Right? Again, it's in some ways very close to Benedict Anderson's sort of work in terms of imagined communities. Right? The voice appealing does, in its terms of actuality, this paragraph speaks from and about a present matter. The absence between a sender and recipient is filled for this present. On the other hand, the familiar style with which it refers in general terms and the brotherhood constructed without obstacles since the opening of this letter, the greeting and all along in the full text, not only using we over and over, but talking about, quote, family matters with passion, for example, when it is said, quote, before staining us with a fine minor drop of the blood of our innocent brothers, we all spilled everything ours for the defense of our rights and of our common interests, end quote. Or when the letter concludes, for example, quote, the America will assemble the extremities of the ground, and its inhabitants will be tied by the common interest of only one brother's, this big family. We is the key for the intimacy of Vizcarra's letter. It homogenizes the diversity of the struggle, the dissatisfaction of the peculiarity of the situation of many as they were in Spanish Americas.